So sometimes you may hear me break into the reading and tell you some personal information or what it means to me or what I think's going on. If you don't like it, don't listen, I guess. But before chapter 1, when I open this book, there's a dedication. It says, "Dedicated to Sophia, the divine mother of faith, hope, and love." That means a lot to me. My daughter's name is Sophia, and she has taught me much wisdom. Chapter 1, The Beauty of the Mountains. I am penning these lines in a little village in the Alpine Mountains in southern Bavaria, only a short distance from the Austrian frontier. The impressions I received yesterday are still fresh in my mind. The experiences which caused them were as real to me as any other driven by the events of everyday life. Nevertheless, they were of such an extraordinary character that I can't persuade myself that they were more than a dream. Having finished the long and tedious labor of investigating the Rosicrucians' history and studying old worm-eaten books, moldy manuscripts hardly legible from age, passing days and parts of nights in convent libraries and antiquarian shops, collecting and copying everything that seemed of any value for my object in view, I made up my mind to grant myself a few days' holiday among the sublime scenery of the Tyrolean Alps. I've noticed that Madame Blatvatsky, they say she wrote this book in 1987. She uses words that we don't use anymore. Like, I don't know what the Tyrolean Alps really is, but I know in some of her other books, she calls a manatee a duodong. So I think they just talked a little different back then. The mountains were still covered in snow, although the spring had advanced. But I was anxious to escape the city's turmoil and noise, to breathe once more the pure, exhilarating air of the mountain heights, to see the shining glaciers glistening like vast mirrors in the light of the rising sun, and to share the feeling of the poet Byron when he wrote the following verses. "He who ascends to mountain tops shall find the loftiest peaks most wrapped in clouds and snow. He who surpasses or subdues mankind must look down on the hate of those below. Though high above the sun of glory glow, and far beneath the earth and ocean spread, round him are icy rocks, and loudly blow contending tempest on his naked head, and thus reward the toils which to these summits led." Boarding the train at K, I soon arrived at S. Thence I wandered on foot, highly enjoying the change from the smoky atmosphere of the crowded streets to the fresh air of the country, pregnant with the odor of pines and daisies, the latter appearing where the snow had gone. The road led up through the river valley, and as I advanced, the valley grew narrower, the sides of the mountains steeper. Here and there were clusters of farmhouses and some rustic cottages clinging to the projecting rocks of the mountains as if seeking protection against the storms which often blow through these valleys. The sun was sinking down below the western horizon and gilded the snowy peaks of the mountains and the brazen cross on the top of the spire of the little village church, from which tolled the curfew, or, as it is here called, the Ave Maria. When I arrived at O, the starting point for my excursions into the mountains. Now, you may be a little confused while she's using letters instead of names of towns. It's because she finds a hidden knowledge, and you can't just give that information to everybody. If she said the names of these towns, you'd have thousands of Americans over there going, "We want to see what Helena Blavatsky saw." So that's what's going on there. Finding a hospitable reception in the village inn, I soon retired and awoke early in the morning, having been aroused from my sleep by the tinkling of little bells hanging around the necks of the goats sent out to their pasturage. I arose and stepped to the window. The night's shadows were fleeing before the approach of the coming sun. The dawn had begun, and before me in sublime array stood the grand old peaks of the mountains, reminding me of Edwin Arnold's description of the view from the windows of Prince Siddhartha's palace, Vishramban. There the grand mountains stood, ranged in white ranks against the blue untrod. infinite, wonderful, whose uplands vast, and lifted universe of crest and crag, shoulder and shelf, green slope and icy horn, riven ravine and splintered precipice, led climbing the thought higher and higher until it seemed to stand in heaven and speak with gods. Soon I was on the way and wandered further up the valley along the riverbed, but here it was merely a small stream, rushing and dancing wildly over the rocks, while further down, where it had grown, it flowed in tranquil majesty through the plains. The valley seemed to cut through long mountain ranges, and other valleys open into this. Some of these valleys were known to me as I had roamed them and explored their mysterious recesses, caves, and forests some 20 years ago. Still, there was one mysterious valley I hadn't yet explored, which led towards a high, bifurcated mountain peak, whose summit was said to be inaccessible, and upon which the foot of no mortal had ever trod. Towards this valley I seemed to be attracted by some invisible but irresistible power. I felt as if, in its unexplored depths at the foot of this inaccessible mountain, the secret and undefined longings of my heart were to be satisfied, as if a mystery would be revealed to me whose solution couldn't be found in books. The sun hadn't yet risen, and the dark woods to the right and left were of a uniform color. As I entered the narrow, mysterious valley, the path rose gradually, leading through a dark forest along the side of a mountain. Slowly and almost imperceptibly, it ascended. At first, it was near the rushing stream, but as I progressed, the torrent's roar sounded more distant. The foaming stream seemed to sink further down. At last, the forest became thinner, and the dark woods were now far below me. Before me and above the intervening trees rose the naked cliffs of the inaccessible mountain. Still, the path led up higher. Soon the distant noise of a waterfall was heard, and I approached again the bed of the mountain stream, which now seemed to be a mass of rocks, split into pieces by some giant power, lying about in wild confusion, while the white foam of the water danced between the cliffs. Here and there were little islands of soil covered with green vegetation. They stood like isolated tables amid the wilderness, for the combined action of water and air had decomposed and eaten away a great part of their foundations, and they looked like plates of soil resting upon small pedestals. Hard as they are, their final tumble is merely a question of time, for their foundations were slowly crumbling away. My path took me upwards, sometimes nearing the riverbed, sometimes receding from it, sometimes over steep rocks, and again descending to the bottom of ravines formed by the melting snow. Thus I entered deep into the mysterious valley when the first signs of sunrise appeared upon the cliffs above my head. One of these towering peaks was crowned with a halo of light, while beyond it the full sunlight streamed into the valley below. A mild breeze swept through the treetops, and the foliage of the birch trees, with which the pine forest was sprinkled, trembled in the morning air. No sound could now be heard, except occasionally the note of a titmouse, and more rarely the cry of a hawk, which rose in long-drawn spiral motions high up into the air to begin its day's work. Now the ash-gray walls and cliffs began to assume a pale silvery hue, while in the rents and crags of the rock the dark blue shade seemed to resist the influence of the light. Looking backwards, I saw how the valley widened, and far down the stream could be seen wandering toward the plains, obtaining more room as it advanced. It spread and formed ponds and tanks and little lakes among the meadows. On the opposite side of the valley, the tops of high mountains rose far into the sky and between the interstices of the summits. Still more summits arose. The foot of the range was covered with dark vegetation, but the mountainsides exhibited a great variety of colors, from the almost black appearance of the rocks below to the ethereal white of the farthest peaks, whose delicate hues seemed to blend with the pale blue sky. Here and there the surface was already covered with spots of light from the rising sun, falling through the rents of the rocks and through the branches of trees, foreboding the near arrival of the orb of day. Thus the higher peaks enjoyed the warm sunlight long before it shone into the valley below. But while it shone in its full brightness upon the mountaintops, the dark shadows in the deep valley became thinner and began to disappear. At last the solemn moment arrived, and the sun rose in sublime majesty over the mountaintops, becoming visible to all. The shadows fled, and a flood of light penetrated the valley, lighting up the dark pine forest and illuminating the rock caves, shining upon the fields of snow and the glaciers. Its light was reflected as in a mirror and produced a blinding effect, but upon the rocky surface it softened, giving it the appearance of 1,000 various hues. The road turned around a projecting part of the mountain height, and suddenly I stood in full view of the inaccessible mountain. Between where I stood and the base of the mountain, there was a well-nigh treeless plain, and the soil was almost without vegetation. Everywhere the ground was covered with stones and rocks, many of which seemed to have fallen down from the mysterious mountain and broken in the fall. Here and there was a small spot covered with moss or thin vegetation, sending fantastically shaped green branches upward along the sides of the inaccessible mountain towards the bare gray walls of the summit, where giant sentinels of a foreboding mind stood eternal and immovable, and seemed to defend their stronghold against the aggressive vegetation, crowding the latter back into the valley. Thus the everlasting combat raged for untold ages still continued. But the front lines of the contending armies changed from year to year. Everlasting like the eternal truths stand the bare gray rocks upon the summits. Here and there the vegetation invades their kingdom, like illusions approaching the realm of the real. Death is victorious. The green spots are buried each year under the descending rocks. But again, life is the victor, for those rocks decay, and a new life appears upon their withered faces. In the limestone formation of the alpine ranges, the rocks decomposed by wind and rain often assume the most fantastic shapes, which suggest the names given to the mountains. Very little imagination is required to behold the shape in the summits of the Waldenkaiser mountain. The figure of the Emperor Barbarossa, with his long red beard, crown, and scepter lying in state, unaffected by the cold of the winter or the summer's heat, waiting to be resurrected. Or we may see in the shape of the Hawkvogel the form of an eagle spreading its wings, in the Witterhorn the shape of the horns of a ram, etc. At the base of the mountains and valleys, the soil is covered with small loose rocks and piles of sand, in the midst of which coal's foot spread its large green leaves, and the blue bell-shaped flowers of monkshood wave their heads. In some secluded spot grows the celebrated edelweiss, resembling in size those which grow on the Popocatépetl in Mexico and the Cordilleras of South America. Sorry if I got those wrong. There may also be found the mountain gentian, the alpine rose, the mandrake, mountain arnica, the mysterious St. John's wort, and other curious plants full of healing powers and strange virtues. Wherever a sufficient quantity of soil has accumulated to enable a tree to grow, a larger kind of vegetation appears. Still, the little crust of earth isn't deep enough to afford a solid footing for large trees. They may grow to a certain height, but someday a storm will rise and sweep down the mountainsides, then the work of destruction begins. Grand old tree corpses, whose roots have been torn from the soil, lie about, their barkless bleached branches like so many skeleton arms stretched up towards heaven as if they had been calling for help in the hour of their death. But no help had arrived. Smaller growths of dwarf trees surrounded them and cover the ground or feed like parasites upon the substance of the dead. The spring had advanced, but among these mountains the seasons are interlaced with each other. The red and yellow leaves painted by autumn are seen among the green foliage of the stunted pines. The moss clinging to the steep precipice shows the reddish color of autumn, and in many clefts the caverns linger in the snow and ice of the past winter. Still, above the red and green, the pure white snow, the gray masses of the summits rise in a succession of pillars and points, with domes and spires and pinnacles like a city built by the gods, while in the background spreads the gray or blue canopy of heaven. Thin streams of water run down from these heights over the precipices, and as they splash over the projecting rocks, they are reduced to vapor before reaching the ground below. The rocks themselves have been hollowed out, forming large caves, indicating how powerful those little veins of water may become if swelled by the floods from the melting snows of the summits. After enjoying the sublime scenery for a few minutes, I continued on my way and approached a little stream from a waterfall in the distance. I wandered along its border. The water was deep, but so clear that even the smallest pebble could be distinctly seen at the bottom. Sometimes it appeared as motionless, as if it were liquid crystal penetrated by the sun's rays, and again, meeting obstacles in its way, it foamed in its rocky bed as if a sudden fit of rage, while in other places the water tumbled in little cascades over pretty pebbles and stones, forming miniature cataracts which exhibited various colors. In this solitude, there is nothing to remind one of humanity's existence except the occasional sawn-off tree trunk showing the destructive influence of human activity. Rainwater collected in some old rotten hollow trunks sparkled in the sun like mirrors, such as may be used by water nymphs. Around their edges, little mushrooms are growing, which our imagination transforms into chairs, tables, and baldacchinos for fairies and elves. Where I stood, the ground was covered with moss, with the occasional great white thistle whose sharp-pointed leaves sparkled in the sunlight. At a short distance, I saw a small grove of pines, looking like an island in the desert, and to that grove I directed my steps. There I resolved to rest and enjoy the beauty of nature. I laid myself down upon the moss in a place overshadowed by a mighty pine. The music of the mountain stream was heard at a distance, and opposite to where I rested there was a waterfall, spreading into a vapor as it fell over the rocks, and in the haze appeared the colors of the rainbow. The mist fell into a basin formed of rock, and from a rent in this basin, overgrown with moss, the water foamed and rushed, hastening down towards the valley to become united with the main body of the river. For a long time I watched the water play, and the longer I watched, the more it became alive with forms of the most singular shape. Super-mundane beings of great beauty seemed to dance in the spray, shaking their heads in the sunshine and throwing showers of liquid silver from their streaming curls and waving locks. Their laughter sounded like that of the falls of Minnehaha, and from the rock crevices peeped the ugly faces of gnomes and kobolds, slyly watching the fairies dance. Above the fall, the current seemed to hesitate before throwing itself over the precipice, but below, where it left the basin, it appeared to be irritated by the impediments in its way, and impatient to leave its home, while far down in the valley, where it became united to its brother, the river, it sounded as if the latter was welcoming it back to its bosom, and as if both were exulting over their final union in a glad jubilee. What is the reason that we imagine such things? Why do we endow dead things with human consciousness and sensation? Why are we, in our moments of happiness, unsatisfied to feel that we live in a body, but our consciousness craves to go out of its prison house and mix with the universal life? Is our consciousness merely a product of the organic activity of our physical body, or is it a function of the universal life, concentrated, so to say, in focus within the physical body? Is our personal consciousness dependent for its existence on the physical body? And does it die with the latter? Or is there a spiritual consciousness belonging to a higher, immortal, and invisible spiritual self, which is temporarily connected with the physical organism, but which may exist independently of the latter? If such is the case, if our physical organism is merely an instrument through which our consciousness acts, then this instrument is not our real self. If this is true, our real self is where our consciousness exists and may exist independently of the latter, i.e., our body. If we mentally float along the curves of the mountaintop, sinking gradually downward, rising suddenly upwards, and examining in our imagination the things upon their surface, why do we feel such a sense of exhilaration and joy, as if we were really there, but had to leave our material body behind because it is too heavy to accompany the spirit to the top of the inaccessible mountain? Is it true that a part of our life and consciousness must remain in its physical form to enable it to continue to live during our absence and to attend to the functions of life? Still, we have read of somnambules in persons in an ecstatic condition whose inner spiritual self, with all its powers of consciousness, sensation, and perception was absent from their apparently dead forms, and who visited distant places, going and returning with the velocity of thought, and bringing descriptions of such places which were afterwards verified and found to be true. Why do we find life in all things, even those considered dead? If we merely put ourselves in a condition where we can perceive that they are living, can there be any dead matter in the universe? Is not even a stone held together by the cohesion of its particles and attracted to the earth by gravitation? But what else is this cohesion and gravitation but energy? And what is energy but the soul? An interior principle called force, which produces an outward manifestation called matter, but which must ultimately be identical with force or substance, or by whatever name we may call a thing, of which we have no conception. If this view is correct, all things possess life, all things possess soul, and there may be soul beings whose outward forms are not so gross as ours, and who are therefore invisible to our physical senses, but may be perceived by our own soul. In the silence of nature, thoughts grow to be waking dreams, and dreams become visions. I imagined how in this solemn solitude I might remain for the rest of my life, perhaps sharing my habitation with a few congenial friends. I imagined how, united by common interests and having identical objects in view, we might be happy and obtain knowledge together. Here, far away from the superficiality and shallowness of common life, a far greater clearness of mental perception, a much deeper concentration of thought, and a much higher conception of the truth regarding the mysteries of nature and human beings might be obtained. How much would our senses be sharpened to perceive external and internal things? How much would our knowledge of self increase? What should we care about the tomfooleries of what is called society? What should we care to know about what is going on in that great insane asylum called the world? Here we could live undisturbed within our own selves, unpestered by the necromantic practices of society, which daily and hourly force us to go out from ourselves to appear where we don't desire to be, compel us to act as we don't desire to act, to bow down before the goddess of fashion, whom we despise in our hearts. Would such a life be useful for us and useful for others? If it is true that the world and we are made up of different ideas, then it is just in such solitudes that the best conditions might be found to grasp and remodel ideas. Thoughts and ideas can't be mere illusions. They must have a real existence, as real and perhaps more lasting than the objective things of this world. For we know that ideas outlive the death of the forms in which they are represented. We know that ideas, like other fruits, are born and become mature, and whenever an idea is mature, it appears on the mental horizon of the world, and is often grasped at the same time by some receptive minds. I'm breaking in here. This is me. What she just said there is the same reason why the cotton gin was invented by two people at the same time. The telephone was invented by two people at the same time. Tesla and Marconi both invented the radio at the same time. That's what she's talking about there. One who can grasp and remodel exalted ideas and give them material expression may do much more for the world's benefit by living alone and in solitude than by living among the world, where their work is continually impeded by affairs of minor importance. The idea which they shape won't die with their body. They will be thrown upon the great mirror, the astral light, and be preserved in the world's memory to be grasped and utilized by others. What is that being we call human after all? What is this living animal organism of flesh, blood, and bones, nerves and mind, which lives for a while and then dies, and which the great majority of people esteem so highly as if it were their own immortal self, and for the comfort of which they often sacrifice their self-respect, their dignity, their honor, and their virtue? Is it anything else than an animal in whom an intellectual activity of a higher order than in other animals predominates? Can this mental activity be the product of the mechanical, chemical, and physiological activity of dead matter? If not, What is the cause of this activity? And can this cause exist independently of the form? What is a human being without any intelligence? If intelligence, as it must be, is an attribute of the spirit, what is a human being without any spirit and without spiritual intelligence? While meditating on this question, a stupid laugh sounded close by my side. I had been so engaged with my thoughts that I hadn't noticed the stranger's approach. But looking up, I saw close by my side one of the locals often found in the mountainous countries of Switzerland and Savoy. I was somewhat surprised and startled, and not a little annoyed at the unwelcome interruption, and I asked him rather abruptly, "What do you want?" A broad grin passed over the dwarf's face, for such he certainly was, as he answered, "Master says I should guide you to his house." I was somewhat astonished by his reply, but thinking that no intelligent answer was to be expected from him, I asked, "Who is your master?" His answer was, "Imperator," and as he spoke that word, a spark of intelligence seemed to shine in his eyes, and his tone indicated that this Imperator, whoever he might be, was undoubtedly somebody whom this dwarf rendered implicit obedience. I attempted to ask him more questions and find out who this Imperator was or where he lived, but all my efforts were to no avail, and the dwarf merely grinned and repeated the words he had already said. Therefore, I finally decided to go with him and see how this adventure would end. The dwarf walked ahead, and I followed him towards the base of the inaccessible mountain. While walking, my guide often turned back to see whether I was following him, so I had a good opportunity to study his dress and features. He wasn't over 3 feet high, and evidently a hunchback. His clothing consisted of a hooded brown gown, which made him appear like a small Capuchin monk of the order of St. Augustine. An immense big head and a comparatively large body rested upon very thin and small legs, while his feet seemed again to be extraordinarily large. Perhaps because of his small size and the healthy color of his face, he appeared to be almost a child. But this opinion was contradicted by the gray beard of considerable length adorning his face. He carried a staff made of a tree limb, which he had evidently picked up on his way. All right, everyone. That concludes chapter 1. And I just want to say, the first time I read this book, I wasn't as far on my spiritual journey, and I thought some of it sounded like hogwash. I understand that some of you probably feel that it sounds like hogwash. I'm just going to relate this little anecdotal thing. You know how little kids sometimes say they were playing with somebody that wasn't there, or they seen grandpa who had passed a month ago, and maybe they talk about their last life, reincarnation. All that stuff goes away about 6 years old, 7 years old. Once society tells them that that stuff doesn't exist, it's not real. Quit talking about it. It does exist. It is real. And it's time we go back that way, I think. Stay tuned for chapter 2, coming soon.